Buddha's theory of relativity. Yourself is not the constant. Your karma is. There's a parallel between the Buddha's teachings and the theory of relativity. Most people think that relativity means that everything is relative, but that's not the case. It simply means that the constant is not what we thought it was. In Newton's theory, space and time were constants, and everything else was relative to them. But then Einstein came along and said, no, the speed of light is the constant. Space and time are relative to that. It's a little disorienting, thinking that space could shrink or expand, time could speed up, slow down, relative to their speed next to the speed of light. The parallel is that we ordinarily think of ourselves as a constant, me and my story. And our experience of pleasure and pain is pretty random. Sometimes we do good things, and we get bad results. We do bad things and get good results. We do good things and get good results. Bad things, bad results. It doesn't seem to make any sense. What's relative? What's constant? But think about the Buddha on the night of his awakening. In his first knowledge, his identity was the constant he was trying to trace, but he saw that his identity was pretty random. From one lifetime to the next, it would change. And it didn't necessarily go up. Sometimes it would go down, way down. An analogy he used later was that it's like throwing a stick up into the air. Sometimes it lands on this end, sometimes it lands on that end, sometimes it lands splat in the middle. So his question was, is there a pattern to the ups and downs, or was it truly random? Then in the second and third knowledges, he found out that there was something that was constant. The laws of causality, particularly as they pertain to karma, intentional actions. So the question is not so much who you are, it's what you do. And who you are is a result of what you do. That changes the constant because who you are can change. There's a lot of good news there too. If you hold on to yourself and say, I'm this kind of person and I wouldn't feel comfortable being anything else, reflect on the fact that you've been many identities. Think of a John Moon recollecting his previous lifetimes. He came across a period when for 500 lifetimes he was a dog. It's hard to think of a John Moon as a dog, but as he said, there was a period when he was satisfied with the pleasures of dogs, dog sensuality, and that's why he was stuck there. So if it could happen to a John Moon, imagine your past history. It's all kinds of things, which is why all kinds of things happen to us, based on the actions of the many different identities we've assumed all along. The constant is this pattern that in acting on skillful intentions, you get good results. Acting on unskillful intentions, you get bad results. Now, the working out of that pattern can be complex because what you're experiencing right now is not totally determined by the past. It's also partially shaped, in fact, largely shaped by your skills here in the present moment, how skillfully you shape your thoughts, your words, your deeds, your experience of the body, your experience of feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, even consciousness. All these things are shaped by intentions. This is why, when we meditate, we're sitting here with our eyes closed to look at what we can do to improve our internal skills. As issues come up that deflect us from the present moment, think of them in terms of karma. As I said, karma is the constant. Your identity is not. People can do things to you which you think are horrible, and you can tell yourself, I never would have done that. Why is this happening to me? Well, how do you know? If you hadn't done something like that sometime in the past, it wouldn't be happening to you now. So remember, you're not the constant. What you are is relative to the principle of action, the principle of causality. This is why when the Buddha talked about dependent co-arising, and people would ask questions that would try to put it into a context, say, like the context of the world outside or the context of who you are, he would refuse to answer those questions. The pattern of dependent co-arising. That's the constant. Your identity is something shaped within that constant. Your sense of the world is shaped within that constant. It takes a while to get your head around this, but it's a useful theme to learn to think about. Try to see things from that perspective rather than from the perspective of me and my problems or me and my issues. Learn how to take those things apart. As when the Buddha talks about the present moment and the role of fabrication, he says, you experience the aggregates because of this intentional activity. The process of fabrication here and now takes the potential for form, the potential for feeling, perceptions, thought constructs, even consciousness, and turns it into actual aggregates. I was listening to a Dhamma talk the other day in which someone was saying consciousness has to be unconditioned. After all, how could one conditioned thing know another conditioned thing? Well, that's what actually happens. Knowing something is a conditioned process. The only thing that's unconditioned is consciousness without surface, and that has no objects at all. All other consciousness is conditioned. So the question is, how are you conditioning your consciousness right now? What are you focusing on? What are you paying attention to? How are you talking to yourself? Your inner conversation. Have you ever stepped back and just said, well, this is just a bunch of directed thoughts and acts of evaluation, and looked at it simply in those impersonal terms? When thoughts are going through the mind, have you ever stopped to categorize, what are the actual perceptions, the labels I'm putting on things, that have led to this riot of thoughts in my mind? The Buddha talks about the perceptions and categories of Papañca. Papañca is a kind of thinking where you identify who you are, and then once you've taken on that identity, you have to lay claim to your part of the world as your food source in order to survive. Of course, you're going to get into conflict with other people who want food from the same source. So there you are, going from I am the thinker to fighting. Sometimes Papañca is translated as conceptual proliferation. That translation has entered the vocabulary of Vipassana communities, where it simply means that your thoughts are running wild. But for the Buddha, it's not so much that your thoughts are running wild, or how many thoughts you're having, it's the categories you're using to talk about things. Once you put an I am in there, you're trying to make that the constant, and it's going to lead to trouble. So just notice the acts of perception, the labels you put on things. What would happen if you change them? Change the labeling. Take something like colors. We have a pretty set notion of what the different colors are and where one color shades into another. But when you learn different languages, you find that the map of the color wheel is very different from one language to the next. You can't say that one map is more accurate than the others, it's just how things have developed. There's an arbitrariness to our perceptions, even on something basic like that, to say nothing of our ideas about social interactions or our emotional life. They've made lists of words, of emotions that you would have in one language that other languages have trouble describing. So it's good to look at perceptions as pretty arbitrary, pretty random, and then ask yourself, to what extent am I driving myself crazy by holding on to certain perceptions? I could change them to other perceptions that are just as true, but actually more useful. So you look at your perceptions, not so much based on the term you're used to thinking in, but based on where they're coming from, where they're going, parts of a causal process. This was how the Buddha got onto the path, by dividing his thoughts, not in terms of what he liked or didn't like, or what thoughts were his kinds of thinking and not his kinds of thinking, but simply thoughts that came from skillful mental states and thoughts that came from unskillful mental states, thoughts that would lead to good actions, thoughts that would lead to afflictive actions. That's changing the constant, changing the categories. It may be disorienting at first, But you find that the Buddha's way of looking at things in terms of karma and the many identities you've had over who knows how many eons is actually a good tool for liberation. Remember the image of the handful of leaves when he was going through a Simsapa forest. The Simsapa tree has tiny, tiny leaves, like little dimes, even thinner than dimes. They're very small. He picked up a whole handful and said, "Which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves up in the trees?" The monk said, "Of course the leaves in the trees are more numerous." He said, "In the same way, the things I learned in the course of my awakening are like the leaves in the trees. What I've taught, what I've been teaching, is like the leaves in my hand." Among the things he taught, of course, were the teaching on karma, the teaching on dependent co-arising, and the teaching on rebirth. Those are all part of the handful of leaves. They're part of the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the part of the teaching that can help put an end to suffering. So, instead of seeing these teachings as weird artifacts of Asian culture that somehow got stuck in the Buddha's teachings, realize that there's something he thought about, and he chose carefully as tools you can use. So, learn how to use the teaching on karma and rebirth as a tool. As for dependent co-arising, that's a very complex tool if you try to comprehend the whole thing. But break it down. As the Buddha said, if you bring awareness to any one of the connections there, between one event and the one right next to it, that's enough to bring the whole thing down. So, look at the different connections and see which ones speak to you. The connection between ignorance and fabrication is a useful one to start with, because as you're sitting here meditating, you're getting direct hands-on experience with bodily fabrication, i.e., the in and out breath and all the variations of the ways that you can breathe. Verbal fabrication, directed thought and evaluation, all the different ways you can talk to yourself about the breath, all the different questions you can ask, all the different ways you can try to change the breath and evaluate what you've done. And then mental fabrications, feelings and perceptions, i.e., the mental images you use. Try out different ones. Learn how to master them. I was reading an article today on the topic of mastery, and they were saying that people who master a skill have 4 qualities: enthusiasm, generosity in the sense of really giving themselves to their field, unbroken concentration, and playfulness. Well, those correspond to the basis for success. Enthusiasm corresponds to Shanda, desire. Generosity, in the sense of really giving yourself to the practice, corresponds to persistence, energy, effort. Unbroken concentration corresponds to intentness. And playfulness is a part of your using your powers of analysis, trying something out, seeing what works. If that doesn't work, using your ingenuity to figure out something else. Try to master just these issues of bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication, seeing them as processes, not so much as your old ways of talking to yourself, your old ways of perceiving things, or even your old ways of breathing. If you get the you out of the way, the me out of the way, you find there's a lot to play with and a lot of possibilities there that you wouldn't have thought of before. So, try to get a clear sense of what really is constant, i.e., the pattern of causality, and how everything else is relative to that. That's a tool for liberation. The logic of not-self. In his second recorded discourse, MV 163847, the Buddha taught that the 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, thought fabrications, and consciousness, are not self. This was a statement he was to repeat many times during the 45 years that he taught. Obviously, he had his reasons for making it. The question is, what kind of reasons were they? One common modern explanation is that he wanted, in an indirect way, to take a position on the question of whether there is a self, along with such related questions as, what are you? Do you even exist? According to this explanation, the Buddha treated the issue of the existence or non-existence of the self as a problem of deductive logic, arguing from definitions and general principles to their logical conclusion. But the Buddha's own analysis of how we create and use our sense of self shows that in teaching not self, he was employing a logic of a more pragmatic and much more effective sort. The deductive proof of not self usually goes something like this. Major premise: to be a self, something must be permanent. Minor premise: what you are is nothing but the five aggregates, none of which are permanent. Conclusion: therefore, you have no self. This conclusion is sometimes followed with a corollary. If you persist in holding to a self, it's because you refuse to listen to logic. The whole proof, though, is very weak, both on its own merits and in terms of how it's supposed to function in the Buddha's teachings. When we check the Pali Canon, the earliest extant record of what the Buddha taught, we find that he never used this proof. But before we look into the arguments he did use to explain not self, it's worth exploring the weaknesses of the deductive proof to show why the not self teaching, if it's going to be convincing, needs a stronger foundation than the proof can provide. To begin with, on its own merits, the proof starts with a general principle that's totally arbitrary. Many people, from before the Buddha's time up to the present, have defined the self as impermanent, so the argument would have no impact on them at all. The Buddha himself noted that there were doctrines of this sort, DN1, DN15, so if he had wanted to assume that self had to mean permanent self, he would have had to offer his reasons for assuming so. But he never did. Secondly, in terms of how the proof is supposed to function in the Buddha's teachings, it's hard to see what would be accomplished by insisting that the self has to be permanent, or that what you are is a bundle of the five aggregates. The actual function of the not-self teaching can be seen from its context. The second recorded discourse ends with the note that the listeners gained full awakening because their minds were freed from clinging. And in the first recorded discourse, MV 1:6-1731, in which the Buddha taught the four noble truths to the same group of listeners, we learn in the first noble truth that suffering boils down to clinging to the aggregates, and that it can be ended when, through dispassion, the causes of clinging are completely abandoned. This is precisely where the deductive proof would actually get in the way of carrying out the Buddha's instructions. The not-self teaching is meant to lead to awakening by inducing dispassion for any act of clinging to the five aggregates. But to identify what you are as the aggregates would simply give you more reason to cling to them. Even though they're impermanent, you would have nothing and be nothing without them, so you might as well hold on to what you've got. In fact, a heightened awareness of how insubstantial and precarious what you are is would easily give you all the more reason to hold on tight and to protect what you are at all costs, even if it meant having to dance with what is constantly morphing in your grasp. So, when people continue to hold on to their sense of self in the face of the deductive proof, it's not because they're being illogical. They simply have their pragmatic reasons for holding on. They're making a value judgment. Given what they see as the available options, the pleasures offered by the five aggregates are worth the effort of clinging to them, despite their limitations. In fact, this value judgment is what the Buddha's actual not-self rationale is designed to attack, by pointing out that there is another option, and that it offers pragmatic reasons for why letting go of any sense of self in the aggregates would actually offer more long-term pleasure and happiness than is possible by holding on. The Buddha approaches the issue of self first by avoiding any position on the question of what the self might be and whether it exists. As he told a group of monks, questions such as, "What am I? Do I exist? Do I not exist?" aren't worth paying any attention to because they lead to a thicket of views that can get you so entangled that you can't get out. MN2. And as he told Vinay Ananda, SN 4410, to take a position on the question of the existence of the self actually gets in the way of following the path to overcome clinging. If you say there is a self, you side with the eternalists, those who teach that the self lasts throughout time. What this seems to mean is that, regardless of how you define yourself, you are like the eternalists in that you tend to cling to whatever you identify as you. If you say there is no self, you fall in with the annihilationists who taught that after death, you no longer remain to receive the results of your actions, a teaching that discourages the effort needed to practice the path to the end of clinging. So, the Buddha found that to avoid falling in with the eternalists or annihilationists, he had to be a strategist. Rather than focus on the existence or non-existence of the self, he focused on the real problem, the actions by which a sense of self is formed and becomes an object of clinging, what he called I-making and my-making, MN 72. Rather than try to define you as the 5 aggregates, he zeroed in on the process by which you use the 5 aggregates to define yourself, his purpose being to show you how to deconstruct the process. He noted that people have formulated many different senses of self: finite, infinite, permanent, impermanent, cosmic, individual, but in every instance the sense of self is an assumption about aggregates, and it's fabricated out of aggregates, SN 2281. As with every other fabrication, it's put together for the sake of a desired end, SN 2279. In other words, it's a strategy for pleasure and happiness. We identify with our body, for example, both as a producer and as a consumer of pleasures. We can use it to find food. When it eats, we partake of the pleasant feelings it can create. The same principle holds for the remaining aggregates. Our thoughts and perceptions help us navigate through the world, and satisfying thoughts and perceptions give us happiness in and of themselves. The Buddha doesn't deny that the aggregates provide these pleasures, SN 2260. He simply points out that they also inevitably entail pain. Because every assumption of a self, no matter how the self is defined, is made of aggregates, every act of assuming a self entails some suffering. And because the aggregates are inconstant, simply arising and passing away, even more changeable and unstable than a self annihilated only at death, you can't just assume a self once and for all and be done with the process. You have to keep on assuming selves without respite. The first starts by focusing directly on habit and practice clinging. He has you apply the perceptions of drawbacks to the practice of concentration and discernment themselves. And 936 shows how this is done. First, you analyze your state of concentration into the 5 aggregates that comprise it. Then you apply the 3 perceptions, or variations of them, to those aggregates. As you develop dispassion even for the subtle pleasure and equanimity of concentration on the grounds that they're fabricated, you incline the mind to the unfabricated. Then, as fabrications fall away and you discern the deathless, you have to be careful not to cling even to that act of discernment. As you develop dispassion for it, your dispassion becomes all around. There's nothing left to cling to, and you can reach total unbinding. Because nibbana can be experienced only when fabrication ends, we can attain it only when we've learned how to overcome our addiction to the desire and passion that fuel fabrication. The first step in the cure is to see all these processes in action. This is why we meditate, constructing mindfulness and states of concentration out of the aggregates, AN 936. This sensitizes us to what the aggregates are, activities, SN 2279, and to how they work. In particular, we realize the active role we play in shaping them, not only in meditation, but also in daily life. Paradoxically, the mastery of concentration involves developing a healthy sense of self as a meditator, both because you have to be responsible for doing the meditation and because you have to anticipate that you'll benefit from it. But the paradox is something of a setup. Once you've grown attached to the pleasure of concentration and have used it to disidentify with unskillful mental states and unskillful senses of self, the Buddha has you turn your heightened sensitivities on the concentration itself, in 936. This is where he supplements the Four Noble Truths with 3 further steps: seeing the allure of the aggregates, why you fall for them, seeing their drawbacks, and when seeing that the drawbacks far outweigh the allure, finally gaining escape from them through dispassion, SN 2257. The step of focusing on the drawbacks is where the perception of not-self comes into play, together with the perceptions of inconstancy and stress. The Buddha has you focus on the inconstancy of the aggregates, watching them arising and passing away, to observe 2 things. Yuan 1. They aren't totally under your control. If they really were you or yours, you could have a body, feelings, etc., exactly as you wanted them, but you can't, SM 5611. 2. If they were yourself, you'd arise with them, so it'd be impossible to watch them arise. Similarly, you'd pass away with them, making it impossible to see them pass away, MN 148. So, for these 2 reasons, these building blocks for your sense of self can't possibly be what you are. But rather than getting you sidetracked into the question of what is actually watching them, the Buddha has you then go on to focus on the stressfulness of the aggregates until it hits home that even though you play a role in shaping them, they turn around to bite you. SN 2279. When compared to the possibility of an unchanging, effortless, deathless happiness, they're simply not worth the effort that goes into shaping them and identifying with them as me or mine. In this way, the Buddha gives you reasons to reverse your earlier value judgment for the sake of your long-term welfare and happiness. MN 22, SN 35, 1101. Acts of clinging to the aggregates, using them to create a self for the sake of finding happiness, may work in the short term, but in the long term, they actually get in the way of the highest happiness possible. Even clinging to the deathless, something that happens at the lower levels of awakening, AN 936, would get in the way of fully awakening to the reality of the Third Noble Truth, which is why the Buddha doesn't simply say that the aggregates are not self. All phenomena, fabricated and not, are to be seen as not self, MN 35, for the sake of the truest happiness. Because acts of clinging defeat their purpose, no matter where they're focused, they're not worth the effort that goes into them. That effort makes no sense. That's the logic of not self. It's not a deduction from definitions or general principles, negating only the idea of a permanent self. Instead, it's a pragmatic reasoning, based on taking the Third Noble Truth seriously, that shows how I-making and my-making are, ultimately, counterproductive in the pursuit of happiness, no matter how the I and my are defined. Because the desire for happiness was the whole reason for engaging in those processes to begin with, this pragmatic reasoning puts an end to any desire and passion for them. And because desire and passion were the motive force behind the processes can be allowed to cease. But when you've brought the strategies of self to an end, you don't have to keep engaging in the strategy of not self. When that strategy has done its job, the job is done. You've found a happiness that doesn't need strategies to maintain it, so all strategies, which are fabrications anyhow, can finally be put aside. When even the path is relinquished, there comes an experience of a dimension totally beyond the 6 senses and outside of the dimensions of space and time. The Buddha calls this consciousness without surface. The image is of a light beam that doesn't land on any surface at all, DN 11, MN 49, SN 1264. Some people have suggested that the concept of this consciousness isn't in line with the teaching on not-self, in that it sounds like a crypto-eternal self, but as the Buddha points out, when all experience of the six senses ceases, there is no thought, I am, DN 15. So, concepts of self and not-self don't apply. And, as we've already noted, it's precisely because the unchanging happiness of this consciousness is possible that the logic of not-self works in the first place. So, instead of conflicting with the teaching on not-self, the concept of this consciousness is a necessary precondition for it. After the mind returns to the experience of the six senses, it makes use of fabrications to navigate through the world, and even employs concepts of self and not-self where appropriate. But its relationship to those concepts has totally changed. No longer trying to feed on them, it experiences them disjoined from them, free from any suffering or stress around them, MN 140. The Buddha says that awakened people still use the concept of not-self as a pleasant abiding, SN 22, 122, but even so, they know when to pick it up and when to put it down. As for the logic of not-self, they've used it for its intended purpose, so they don't need to submit to it ever again.